Okay, we're looking at the American Presidency from Chapter 13 of our text. In theory, the three branches of our government, the executive branch, the legislative branch, and the judicial branch, are co-equal. But in practice, they all say, I'm the greatest. So there's tension. There's often a lot of tension between the president and the Congress, as these two political cartoons show. Here's John Boehner, the Speaker of the House of Representatives, obviously at odds with the president there. And here's a political cartoon showing this toilet paper, which has got the Constitution written on it, being thrown back and forth between the president and the Congress. So there are tensions. Well, what are the powers that the president has under the Constitution? An important power is the president. Even though he's a civilian, he's not wearing like a five-star general outfit. He is the commander above all the commanders. He's above all the five-star generals in the Army, the Navy, the Marines, the Coast Guard. He can give reprieves, which means he delays a penalty, or he can pardon someone as if they had never committed a crime. He can pardon almost anyone. And amnesty, he can give a blanket pardon to a whole group of people, like all the draft dodgers that fled to Canada were given amnesty by Ford and President Carter. The Take Care Clause is important in Article 2, Section 3. It says about the presidency, take care that the laws are faithfully executed. So it's the president's job, the executive branch's job, to execute the laws. So in our system, Congress, here pictured by the Capitol, they pass laws, and then those laws ultimately become the responsibility of the president and the huge executive department he has to faithfully execute them, so those laws are given equally to all the states. That's the president's job, to execute the laws. There's been a growth in presidential power, so much so that current presidents are said to be imperial presidents, like they have the power of a king. Well, Washington was our first president. He set a lot of precedents, such as just staying in for 2 terms. He started a cabinet, a group of close advisors. He didn't want to be called Your Highness or something. He said just wanted to be called Mr. President. He set a precedent there to keep the office as being not a king. And when he put down the Whiskey Rebellion, what he was doing is, even as the president, he led the troops himself to go to these farmers that weren't paying a tax, because the national government had set a tax for producing your own whiskey, and he thought if they can get away with that, then our government doesn't mean anything. The executive has to be able to execute the laws, so the Whiskey Rebellion exemplifies that. Andrew Jackson, pictured here, he was the great commoner. He heavily used the veto power, so he was called King Andrew. Even before, the idea was that the veto power was just when laws were unconstitutional, but Jackson used it for laws he didn't like. He was against the national bank, which he thought would favor the rich and not the common citizens. So he used the presidency to defend, the little people. Lincoln, of course, is famous in many ways, helping, get rid of slavery. And he used vast wartime powers, so like no president had before. He declared martial law in Maryland. He shut down certain newspapers. He suspended the writ of habeas corpus. And he issued the Emancipation Proclamation as an executive order without congressional approval. So he vastly expanded the powers in wartime. Teddy Roosevelt was an interesting president. He was a real fighter. He acted as a steward of the public welfare. He created the Food and Drug Administration. He was a great conservationist. And so being a steward of the public welfare, he wanted to make sure that we maintain national parks, the things that would help the common people. The president needs to be a steward of those. And then Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the only president elected 4 times, he began really the modern presidency because he expanded public work so much. During the Depression, he acted boldly and he started Social Security. And he had fireside chats, coming close to the American people through the new media of radio. And they made the American people feel close, listening to their radios, listening to Roosevelt talk about his fireside chats. The imperial presidency, which is what modern presidents are called, because they do have so much power, do they have too much power? Term limits means we should limit political candidates to a certain number of terms. And so because Roosevelt was elected 4 times, the American people said, look, we need to follow the example of Washington. And so they passed a constitutional amendment that limited the president's term to 2 terms in office. You can't serve more than 2 terms. Here's a chart from your book that shows the sole powers of the president and then the ones he shares with the Senate. So as we've talked about, he's the commander-in-chief. He can grant reprieves and pardons. He has to see that the laws of Congress are faithfully executed. and he can appoint a lot of officials to executive office. Now, with the Senate, the president shares the power of making treaties, because he can make the treaties, but they have to be approved by the Senate. Also, he can appoint ambassadors, he can appoint federal judges, Supreme Court justices, but the Senate gets to approve those, so that's a power shared with the Senate. And of course, the being able to pass legislation is something both the Congress and the president do. As far as checks on the other branches, we've just talked about them. The check on the legislative branch is that he can sign or veto legislation. So notice here, here's a bill passed by Congress. It goes to the president. So the president has to take an action. If he signs the bill, it becomes a law. So there's where the president and Congress work together. But if he doesn't sign the bill, it goes back to Congress. They can then override the veto, and it becomes law. But if the president does nothing with a bill that comes to him, so here's a bill that comes to the president from the Congress, he does nothing with it, after 10 days, it becomes a law. If the president doesn't do anything, it becomes a law within 10 days. But if the Congress adjourns during these 10 days, here's a bill passed, but the Congress adjourns before 10 days, it becomes a pocket veto, because by not signing it, it doesn't become law. So again, if a president doesn't sign a law, it becomes a law within 10 days, 10 days after he doesn't sign it. Except if there's an adjournment within those 10 days, then it doesn't become a law. That's called a pocket veto. So the point is, the president, if he doesn't sign a bill, there's two things that can happen. If it goes 10 days, it becomes a law. If it's less than 10 days because the Congress adjourns, it's a pocket veto. The bill is vetoed. The president's check on the judicial branch is the president gets to appoint Supreme Court justices. So the president of the United States, that's a huge power. He can appoint liberals, conservatives, whatever kind of judges he wants onto the Supreme Court. Executive privilege is something in modern times that the presidents say that because of national security and other issues, they don't have to reveal records that they say are confidential to the vital operations of the executive branch. And so that has been challenged by the courts a little bit, but the Supreme Court has recognized the right of presidents to use executive privilege, to say that, hey, we're not giving information, we're not giving this information out, but not totally. The Supreme Court said some things are not in the national interest, that the president has to reveal them. So executive privilege is not absolute. We don't have a king. We have a president that's under limitation. The modern president's job can be divided into the roles that he has. Here's a chart that shows the different roles a president has. As the chief citizen, he's an example to all of us. He has to vote. He's got to father children. He does things that normal citizens do, but he's the chief citizen. He's first. He's the head of the Democratic Republican Party, whichever party he's from. Even though he's not practically the head of the party, there's someone else is the head of the party. The president acts like he's the chief of the party. He appoints the Federal Reserve Board, so he's really the manager of the economy. He helps suggest a budget to Congress. He's our chief executive. He's the CEO. He's the head of the bureaucracy. He can issue executive orders. He's the chief diplomat. He is the one that goes to foreign countries and represents the United States. Even though we have a diplomatic corps, the president's the chief diplomat. We've said that he's the commander-in-chief. He's the leading general. He's the chief of state, and that role, that's a role that, like in England, the Queen does. You know, there's a prime minister in England that does the duties of the political office, but the Queen does the duties of state. Well, in our system, it's the same person. The president does the ceremonial things, like maybe throws out a first pitch at a baseball game. He's the leading person representing America, the chief of state. And he's the chief legislator. Even though he's not a congressman, he gets to veto legislation. In the State of the Union address, he tells Congress what to do. So these are the different roles that the president has. The executive branch of the United States is the largest branch by far. There's way more people in the executive branch than there is in Congress or there is in the courts. Here's a picture of the White House, and you can see the president's Oval Office over here. That's where he has his office is run from, and then the cabinet room where his cabinet meets is over here. So it's called the East Wing. His close staff, he's got a speechwriter, lawyer, press secretary. Those are this shows all of the presidential different agencies and offices, but the White House staff is just that part of it right there. The executive office of the president is advisors about certain things. That's up here, the Office of the Vice President, the National Security Council, Council of Economic Advisors. That is the executive office of the President. Then there's also the executive departments, his cabinet, agriculture, commerce, defense, education, energy. Showing how much we've grown under President Washington, there were only 3 executive departments, the War, State, and Treasury. But that's grown much bigger today. And then there's all the independent agencies, NASA, the CIA, the FCC, the U.S. Postal Service. They're not under any one of those executive departments in the cabinet, but they do answer to the President. There's agencies, commissions, administrations, authorities, corporations. So again, there are millions of people that work for the executive branch. It's the biggest branch of government, and they all answer to the President.